Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilpert, coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. On Sunday, Colombian voters surprised everyone when they voted against the peace agreement between the government and the rebel group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. The no vote won by a razor-thin margin of 50.2%. Voter turnout was relatively low, with only 37% of eligible voters casting a ballot. The peace agreement, which took 4 years to negotiate, was meant to put an end to 52 years of civil war, which cost over 220,000 lives and around 6 million refugees. Shortly after the referendum results were announced, Colombia's president, Juan Manuel Santos, as well as the top commander of the FARC, Timochenko, gave their reactions to the result. Let's take a look.
He dado instrucciones al jefe negociador del gobierno y al alto comisionado de paz para que viajen mañana mismo a La Habana a mantener informados a los negociadores de las FARC sobre el resultado de este diálogo político. Ahora vamos a decidir entre todos cuál es el camino que debemos tomar para que la paz, esa paz que todos queremos, sea posible y salga todavía más fortalecida de esta situación.
Las FARC-EP mantienen su voluntad de paz y reiteran su disposición de usar solamente la palabra como arma de construcción hacia el futuro. Al pueblo colombiano que sueña con la paz, que cuente con nosotros. La paz triunfará. Muchas gracias.
Joining us from Bogotá, Colombia, to take a closer look at this surprising result is Dan Kovalik. Dan is a labor and human rights lawyer with a degree from Columbia University Law School. He has taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law since 2012. Thanks for being on the Real News again, Dan.
Hey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So many polls leading up to the referendum had predicted that that the vote in favor of the peace agreement would win by almost like a 2/3 majority. In the end, though, the no vote won narrowly. Why is that? How do you make sense of this result?
Well, I don't know why the polls varied from what happened. It did appear to be large abstention. I mean, a lot of folks, the voting turnout was poor. Why that was, I don't know. You might have heard Piedad Cordoba opine that maybe there was some paramilitary intimidation that kept some folks away from the polls. The other thing I want to mention is, of course, there was a hurricane over the weekend, which did hit large parts of the Colombian coast. That might have, and I heard that was the reason, in fact, why others didn't show up. So abstention was a problem. Now, in terms of what happened in terms of the vote, what it appears happened is, for the most part, those in the zones of conflict, meaning those in the countryside, peasants, Afro-Colombians, indigenous, largely voted in favor of the peace accord, while those in the city and the expats who have not seen the war in quite some time voted against it. So that seemed to be largely the dynamics working here.
Why would you say, I mean, it makes sense to me that people in the countryside who were particularly affected by the war and the civil war would vote, in favor of a peace agreement and an end to the conflict as soon as possible. But why would people who live in the cities and who were presumably less affected be so opposed? How do you make sense of that?
Well, again, they would not feel the urgency to end the war. And so therefore, other things they were concerned about, for example, one of the things cited was too much amnesty that was built into the accords for human rights abusers. That seemed to be a big issue. That might have been the biggest issue as far as I can tell. And so they focused more on that than on the urgency to have peace.
And how do you see the role of President Santos's unpopularity? I mean, he really staked his whole reputation on this peace agreement, even though he has apparently very low approval rating of something like in the low 20s or even below that right now. Could it be that Colombians just didn't trust him to come up with the best possible deal with the FARC?
Well, yeah, I would think that has to be one of the reasons for what happened. I mean, as one of the Colombians I was talking to yesterday said, he believes Santos delivered exactly no votes to the polls, that he has no pull with the Colombian people. And so, yes, that was, and as you say, he has defined himself with this peace process. So his unpopularity certainly could not have helped in this situation.
And what about the role of former President Álvaro Uribe? He had been campaigning against it. Is he somehow seen as a voice of reason or something among the people who are supporting? I mean, he seems so far to the right. You'd think that he wouldn't have much influence, but that seems to have been perhaps not the case.
Well, again, I don't know how much influence he has, but obviously he was pushing the no vote. And that was what won the day, so one has to presume he had some influence. I would think that it did make some difference that he and his, others associated definitely pushed very hard for the no vote, and I think it had some impact. I do want to say there's a certain irony there, that given that the things he criticized about this peace accord, which was essentially, as I mentioned, too much amnesty, in particular for the guerrillas, was very much a problem for the peace, so-called peace agreement he made with the paramilitaries back in the mid-2000s, which many think was a faked disarmament, and that the paramilitaries never really did disarm. And so for him to be talking about that issue is quite ironic. But again, at the end of the day, he seemed to have some influence.
Well, that was something that I was going to get into, is precisely this issue of the amnesty, because that's what his argument was, and also the people who voted against it to some extent were arguing, it seems, against it on the basis of this amnesty for the FARC. Also, another group that seemed to be opposed to it, which was Human Rights Watch, who condemned the agreement. You're a human rights lawyer yourself. How do you see that amnesty issue play out? I mean, is it really going too far, or what is your evaluation, and what shape did that amnesty take exactly?
Well, look, I mean, it did appear that there was going to be fairly wide amnesty for both government and FARC people. That some leaders would be held accountable, but most of the rank and file would not. Look, I tend to be very pragmatic when it comes to these things. I think that I've never seen a peace agreement in the world that didn't have some type of amnesty, and no one would agree to it if it didn't, So I just think the idea of getting hung up on that, frankly, I think it's more important to find peace right now, given that people are suffering. And in the end, yes, it was up to the Colombian people to decide what, the calculation on that. And I guess they made a decision in a very close vote. Again, what is sad is that those most affected by it went the other way and decided peace at this point was more important than an accord with less amnesty. And
so, I mean, other individuals, such as UN Secretary General and Pope Francis, supported the peace agreement. Apparently that, I guess, didn't really leave that much of an impact. But what do you think is likely to happen now? As was mentioned in the introduction, both sides said they're going to talk to each other again to see how to move forward. From what you can see in the ground, having been in Colombia now just for the vote, what do you think is going to be the next step in terms of, is it possible, in other words, to still rescue this peace agreement?
I think it's obviously much harder today than it was yesterday to find a peace agreement. They've worked 4 years on this. It seems like the government and the FARC are quite sincere in trying to make a peace. And so, yeah, I think it's possible. They're going to go back to the drawing board in Havana, and I hope that they find a way to make a deal that's going to be acceptable.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. But thanks so much for giving us your view from the ground there in Colombia. And we'll certainly, of course, be following the story more as it develops, and hope to have you on again.
Thank you, Gregory. Appreciate it.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.